The morning rain fell like a curse on Marietta, Georgia, the kind of cold November drizzle that seeped through jacket seams and settled into bones. Carmen Delgado stood at the edge of the salvage yard, her sneakers already soaked through, watching her breath curl into the grey air while her 7-year-old daughter Lucia pressed against her hip, shivering. Behind them, their rust-eaten Honda Civic sat with its hazard lights blinking, the engine having finally surrendered on the interstate shoulder 3 miles back, coughing its last mechanical breath before falling silent forever. "Mama, I'm cold," Lucia whispered, her small fingers clutching Carmen's coat pocket, where she knew her mother sometimes kept peppermints. There were no peppermints today. There hadn't been peppermints in weeks. Carmen pulled her daughter closer, her own body offering what little warmth remained. "I know, mija, I know. Just a few more minutes." She stared at the rows of dead vehicles stretching before her like a metal graveyard, searching for anything with 4 wheels and a prayer of running. Her checking account held exactly $47. Her savings account had been empty since August, when the landlord had raised the rent by $200 and given her 72 hours to match it or leave. She had matched it. She had depleted everything to match it. And now, 3 months later, with winter settling its teeth into the south, her car had died on the way to the only job interview she'd secured in 6 weeks. The salvage yard office door swung open, and a heavy man in grease-stained coveralls emerged, coffee steam rising from a styrofoam cup cradled in his thick hands. Earl Jennings had owned this yard for 31 years, had seen every kind of desperate soul wander through his gates looking for salvation on 4 wheels. He recognized the look on Carmen's face immediately, the pinched expression of someone doing mathematics in their head that would never add up, the particular exhaustion of a mother who had stopped sleeping so her children could eat. "Help you?" Earl asked, though he already knew she couldn't afford anything worth helping. Carmen straightened her spine, lifted her chin the way her grandmother had taught her. "Dignity costs nothing, mija. Even when you have nothing, you carry yourself like you have everything." "I need a vehicle, something that runs. I have $300 cash." She did not mention that this 300 represented her entire financial existence, money she had scraped together by selling her grandmother's wedding ring at a pawn shop the previous Tuesday. The ring had been the only beautiful thing she owned, a thin gold band with a tiny diamond chip that her abuela had worn for 53 years of marriage. Carmen had wept in the parking lot after great shuddering sobs that she had hidden from Lucia by pretending to look for something in the trunk. Earl scratched his stubbled chin. $300 bought. Nothing in his yard that would pass inspection. Nothing that wouldn't strand this woman and her shivering daughter on another roadside within a week. He was about to tell her so, was about to suggest she try the bus station instead, when his eyes drifted to the far corner of the lot where a shape sat beneath a blue tarp, untouched for nearly 8 years. "There's one thing," he said slowly, the words surprising even himself. "Old school bus. Been sitting here since 2016. Owner died, no next of kin claimed it. Eventually it came to me for back storage fees. Runs last I checked, but barely. It's not pretty. Not pretty at all." "A school bus?" Carmen's brow furrowed. "I need to get to work. I need to drive my daughter to school. A school bus? It's got wheels and an engine. That's more than what you drove in here with." Earl shrugged. 300, it's yours. Papers and everything. I'll even throw in a full tank of diesel." They walked together through the maze of automotive corpses, Lucia's small hand tight in Carmen's grip, until they reached the far corner, where the tarp rippled in the wind like a burial shroud. Earl grabbed the edge and pulled, and the fabric slid away to reveal what lay beneath. The bus was a ruin. A 1987 Bluebird, its original yellow paint now a patchwork of rust, oxidation, and bird droppings accumulated over years of neglect. The windows were clouded with grime, several cracked, one missing entirely and covered with cardboard and duct tape. The tyres looked low but not flat, and the chrome bumper hung at an angle that suggested it had given up on life, long before the rest of the vehicle. "Mama," Lucia breathed, her eyes wide with something between horror and fascination. It's so big." Carmen stared at the monstrosity before her. A school bus. She was going to drive her daughter to school in a school bus. She was going to arrive at job interviews in a school bus. The absurdity of it pressed against her chest, and she felt something building in her throat, a laugh or a sob. She couldn't tell which. "Does it run?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Earl climbed the 3 steps into the driver's seat, and Carmen noticed that the interior was surprisingly intact, worn but not destroyed, with rows of green vinyl bench seats stretching back into shadows. He turned the key, and the engine groaned, coughed, shuddered, then caught with a rumbling diesel roar that shook the windows. "Runs," Earl confirmed, killing the engine. "Like I said, not pretty, but it runs." Carmen reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope containing 15 $20 bills, money that represented her grandmother's ring, her pride, her last connection to the woman who had raised her after her own mother had vanished into addiction's hungry arms. She handed it to Earl without hesitation, because hesitation was a luxury she could no longer afford. "We'll take it." The laughter started before she even made it out of the salvage yard gates. A group of teenage boys on the sidewalk pointed and howled, their phones raised to capture the spectacle. Carmen kept her eyes forward, hands steady on the enormous steering wheel, as Lucia sat in the front bench seat behind her, buckled in with a lap belt that barely functioned. "Yo, Miss Frizzle's hit hard times," one of them shouted, and the others erupted in fresh waves of hilarity. At the first red light, a woman in a BMW pulled alongside them and stared with undisguised disgust, her manicured hand covering her mouth as if the sight might be contagious. When the light turned green, she accelerated away quickly, as if poverty might, somehow, splash onto her leather seats. "Mama?" Lucia's voice was small from behind her. "Why are people laughing at us?" Carmen caught her daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror. Those dark, serious eyes that had seen too much too young, that carried questions no 7-year-old should have to ask. She thought about lying, about offering some comfortable fiction, about how people laugh at all sorts of things, about how it doesn't mean anything. But she was tired of comfortable fictions. She was tired of pretending their life was anything other than what it was. "Because they don't understand," Carmen said finally. "They don't understand that sometimes the ugly things, the broken things, the things nobody else wants, sometimes those are the things that save you. This bus is going to save us, Mija, I promise. This bus is going to take us somewhere better." Lucia considered this with the gravity only children possess. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt and moved to the window seat, pressing her palm against the cold glass. "I like it," she announced. "It's like having our own house that can drive." Carmen felt the tears come then, hot and sudden, and she blinked them back because she was driving, because she had to be strong, because that was what mothers did. They drove rusted school buses through gauntlets of laughter, and they did not break, could not break, because breaking was not an option when a 7-year-old sat behind them, believing promises about better places. That night, they parked the bus in the lot behind the Days Inn, where Carmen worked the overnight cleaning shift. She made a bed for Lucia on one of the bench seats, layering blankets she had brought from their apartment. The apartment they would lose in 11 days when the rent came due and her bank account sat empty. The bus's heater wheezed warm air that smelled of diesel and dust, and Lucia fell asleep with her stuffed elephant clutched to her chest, while Carmen sat in the driver's seat and stared at the darkness beyond the windshield. $300. A rusted school bus. A child who believed in promises. This was the sum total of Carmen Delgado's empire on the 15th of November, and as the rain continued to fall against the metal roof above her, she allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of silent weeping before wiping her eyes, squaring her shoulders, and beginning to plan how she would survive another day. The eviction came on schedule, delivered by a process server who couldn't meet Carmen's eyes as he handed her the papers. She had known it was coming, had spent the previous 2 weeks quietly removing their possessions, in small trips, loading the bus with clothes and dishes and the few photographs that mattered. Still, standing in the empty apartment where she had brought Lucia home from the hospital, where she had sung lullabies and bandaged scraped knees and dreamed of better futures, Carmen felt something inside her calcify into stone. "Where are we going to live now, Mama?" Lucia asked from the doorway, her backpack hanging from her thin shoulders, ready for school. "We're going to have an adventure," Carmen heard herself say, the words tasting like ash. "Remember what you said about the bus, about it being like a house that can drive? Well, that's what it's going to be for a little while. Our house that can drive." Lucia's face bloomed into unexpected delight. "We're going to live in the bus, like camping, forever camping?" "For a little while," Carmen repeated, "just until Mama figures some things out." The reality of living in a school bus revealed itself in layers of indignity. There was no bathroom, which meant desperate searches for public restrooms, for gas stations with unlocked facilities, for fast food restaurants where Carmen would buy a $1 item just to access the toilet. There was no kitchen, which meant cold sandwiches eaten on paper plates, cans of soup consumed at room temperature because Carmen was terrified of running the engine long enough to generate heat for cooking. There was no address, which meant job applications that went nowhere, interview callbacks that never came, a world that required stability from people who had none to give. Carmen dropped Lucia at school each morning, parking the bus 2 blocks away so no one would see, so the other children wouldn't know, so her daughter could maintain some shred of normal childhood while her mother's life collapsed around her. She would watch Lucia walk through the school gates, backpack bouncing, and then she would drive to whatever parking lot seemed safe that day, and close her eyes and try not to think about what came next. The days in let her go in the 3rd week. "We're restructuring," the manager said, unable to look at her, and Carmen wanted to scream that she had cleaned their toilets for 2 years without complaint, had worked double shifts when others called in sick, had never once been late or left early, or asked for anything she hadn't earned. But she said nothing, because saying nothing was what people like her learned to do, because keeping quiet was safer than making noise, because the people who made decisions had already decided, and nothing she said would change anything. She found work where she could: day labour, cash under the table, cleaning houses, for women who looked through her like she was furniture. One afternoon, she scrubbed the bathroom of a house in Buckhead, a mansion with more square footage in its entryway than Carmen's lost apartment had contained in total. The woman who owned it stood in the doorway, tapping her foot impatiently. "You missed a spot by the faucet," the woman said, her voice dripping with the particular contempt the wealthy reserve for those who serve them. "And you're taking too long. I have guests coming in an hour." Carmen scrubbed harder, her knees aching against the marble floor, her hands raw from chemicals, while her stomach cramped with hunger because she hadn't eaten since yesterday, because she was rationing the money for Lucia's school lunches, because some things mattered more than food. "Sorry," Carmen whispered. "I'm almost done." The woman paid her $40 for 4 hours of work, half what had been promised, and when Carmen started to object, the woman raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "You can take it or leave it. I'm sure there are plenty of other women who would be grateful for the opportunity." Carmen took it. She took it because Lucia needed dinner, because the bus needed diesel, because gratitude was a currency she could not afford to spend on principle. The coldest night came in early December, a freak cold snap that drove temperatures into the single digits and turned the bus into a metal icebox. Carmen piled every blanket they owned onto Lucia, wrapped her daughter in layers of clothing, and then lay beside her, using her own body as a final barrier against the cold. The bus's heater had given out 3 days prior, and Carmen lacked the money to fix it, lacked the money for a motel room, lacked the money for anything except survival, and sometimes not even that. "Mama," Lucia whispered in the darkness, her teeth chattering. "I can't feel my toes." Carmen pulled her daughter closer, rubbed her small feet between her hands, breathed warm air onto tiny fingers that felt like ice. "It's okay, baby. Mama's here. Mama's always here." She said the words like a prayer, like an incantation against the cold that seeped through every crack and seam of their metal shelter. "Mama," Lucia's voice was getting sleepy, dangerously sleepy, and Carmen felt fear spike through her chest. "Why don't we just go home?" "We will, mija," Carmen's voice cracked. "We will go home soon, I promise. Mama's working on it." That night, Carmen made a decision. In the morning, she would go to the county social services office. She would ask for help. She would fill out the forms and answer the questions, and admit finally that she could not do this alone. The shame of it burned in her throat, but it burned less hot than the fear of her daughter freezing to death in a rusted school bus because her mother was too proud to ask for assistance. But something happened in the morning that changed everything. The sun rose pale and cold, and Carmen woke with Lucia, pressed against her, both of them stiff from a night of inadequate warmth. She sat up slowly, her joints protesting, and noticed something she had somehow never noticed before in all the weeks they had lived in this bus. A seam in the floor beneath the driver's seat, a line that didn't quite match the pattern of the rubber mat that covered it. Curiosity was not a luxury Carmen typically allowed herself, but this morning, with the dawn light slanting through the dirty windows, and her daughter still sleeping, she found herself kneeling beside the driver's seat and running her fingers along that odd seam. It felt like a hatch, like a cover over something hidden. She pulled at the edge of the rubber mat, and it came up with a sticky resistance, revealing a metal panel beneath with a small latch she had mistaken for a screw. Carmen's heart began to beat faster. She looked back at Lucia, still bundled in blankets, then turned her attention to the latch. It was stiff with age and rust, but it moved when she applied pressure, and the panel lifted on hinges she hadn't known existed. Below was a compartment, perhaps 2 feet by 3 feet, hidden in the floor of the bus between the frame rails. Inside the compartment was a lockbox, green metal with black corners, covered in dust but otherwise intact. Carmen lifted it out with trembling hands, surprised by its weight, and sat with it in her lap for a long moment before she found the courage to open the latch. The lockbox was not locked. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had yellowed with age, were stacks of currency. Not loose bills, but banded stacks, each one thick as a brick, each one labelled with a paper band that read $10,000. Carmen counted them with shaking hands, her breath coming in short gasps, unable to believe what her eyes were telling her. 20 stacks, $200,000 in cash hidden in the floor of a $300 school bus. But that wasn't all. Beneath the cash was a manila envelope, thick with documents, and a smaller velvet pouch that clinked when she touched it. Carmen opened the pouch first and watched as a cascade of loose diamonds spilled into her palm, dozens of them glittering in the weak morning light like frozen tears. The manila envelope contained photographs, yellowed documents, newspaper clippings, and a letter written in an elegant script that had faded but remained legible. Carmen's hands shook as she began to read. "If you are reading this, then I am dead, and you have found what I spent 40 years hiding. My name was Eleanor Ashford, and I was the housekeeper for the Pemberton family of Atlanta from 1955 to 1995. What you hold in your hands is not stolen. It is owed. It is justice. It is the truth." The letter continued for several pages, telling a story that made Carmen's blood run cold. Eleanor Ashford had worked for the Pembertons, one of Georgia's oldest and wealthiest families, for 4 decades. During that time, she had witnessed crimes that the family had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal: fraud, tax evasion, theft of workers' pensions, and worst of all, the systematic exploitation of black domestic workers who were paid slave wages and threatened with violence if they complained. Eleanor had been one of those workers, and Eleanor had been smart. Over the years, she had documented everything. She had photographed ledgers. She had recorded conversations. She had saved receipts and contracts and evidence of crimes that, if revealed, would destroy the Pemberton Empire. And when Cornelius Pemberton III had died in 1995, Eleanor had slipped into his private safe during the chaos of the funeral preparations and taken what she believed she was owed: the back wages stolen from her and dozens of other workers over 40 years, plus a portion of the diamonds that Pemberton had kept hidden from the IRS. "I know this makes me a thief in the eyes of the law," Eleanor had written, "but the Pembertons stole from us first. They stole our labour, our dignity, our futures. What I took was pennies compared to what they owe. If you have found this, I ask only that you use it wisely. Use it to build something good. Use it to break free from the kind of people who build their fortunes on the backs of the poor. And if you have the courage, expose them. The evidence is all here. The truth is all here. The Pembertons have gotten away with their crimes for too long." Carmen sat in stunned silence, the diamonds glittering in her palm, the cash stacked beside her, the weight of 40 years of hidden history pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her, Lucia stirred and sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Mama, what's that? Carmen turned to look at her daughter, this child she had been unable to keep warm, unable to feed properly, unable to house like a human being deserved to be housed, and she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. It's our future, mija, Carmen said softly. It's our future. She knew she couldn't simply spend the money. 200,000 in cash and a bag of loose diamonds would raise immediate questions. Questions that could lead to police, to investigations, to accusations of theft. Carmen was many things, but she was not naive. She understood that the path forward required careful navigation, required understanding exactly what she possessed and what dangers came with it. She spent the day reading through Eleanor's documents, and what she discovered made the cash and diamonds seem almost insignificant by comparison. Eleanor had been meticulous. She had photographs of her handwritten ledgers showing payments to workers that never appeared on official records, payments that totaled, over 40 years, nearly $50 million in stolen wages. She had recorded conversations between Cornelius Pemberton III and his lawyers discussing how to hide assets from federal investigators. She had copies of falsified tax returns, evidence of insurance fraud, documentation of a pension fund that had been systematically looted. And she had something else, a photograph, faded but clear, of a young black woman holding an infant, standing in front of the Pemberton mansion. On the back, in Cornelius Pemberton's own Cesar handwriting, were the words, "Sarah and child, 1962. The boy's name is James. He must never know." The accompanying documents told the rest of the story. Sarah had been a maid in the Pemberton household. She had become pregnant by Cornelius Pemberton. The child had been taken from her and placed with a family in Alabama, and Sarah had been paid $10,000 to disappear and never speak of what had happened. She had signed a non-disclosure agreement under duress, and she had never seen her son again. Carmen understood, with a clarity that cut through her exhaustion and fear, that she was holding not just money, but ammunition. The Pemberton family was still one of the most powerful in Georgia. The current patriarch, Harrison Pemberton, had served 2 terms in the state Senate and was rumored to be considering a run for governor. The family's real estate empire stretched across the southeast, their name attached to hospitals and university buildings and charitable foundations that proclaimed their benevolence. All of it was built on lies, and Carmen had the proof. The following morning, Carmen found a lawyer. Not a fancy one, she couldn't afford fancy, but a young woman named Priya Sharma, who had hung her shingle in a strip mall office and specialized in cases that bigger firms refused to touch. Carmen brought the lockbox, brought the documents, brought Lucia, and laid everything out on Priya's cluttered desk. Priya was silent for a long time after she finished reading. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you understand what you have here?" "I know it's dangerous," Carmen said. "I know the Pembertons are powerful people." "Dangerous doesn't begin to cover it." Priya leaned back in her chair. "If this documentation is authentic, and I'll need to have it verified, you're sitting on evidence of crimes that could send multiple members of the Pemberton family to prison. The wage theft alone, with interest and penalties, could be worth tens of millions in restitution. The tax fraud could trigger IRS investigations going back decades. The pension fund theft could be federal racketeering charges. And this, she held up the photograph of Sarah and the infant, this is the kind of scandal that ends political careers. "What about the cash and diamonds?" Carmen asked. "Eleanor took them. Does that make me a thief for having them?" Priya smiled grimly. "That's where it gets interesting. Eleanor didn't steal from the Pembertons. She recovered wages they had stolen from her and others. Technically, this was restitution she took upon herself to collect." "And the diamonds?" She picked up one of the stones, examining it in the light. "These came from assets that Cornelius Pemberton hid from the IRS. The family never reported them, never paid taxes on them, never acknowledged they existed. If they try to claim you stole them, they'd have to explain where they came from and why they weren't on any tax return or insurance inventory. They can't come after you without incriminating themselves." "So what do I do?" Priya was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving between Carmen and Lucia, who sat in a corner chair with a picture book, seemingly oblivious to the conversation that would determine her future. "You could take the money and run," she said finally. Sell the diamonds through proper channels, declare it as found property, pay the taxes, 200,000 in cash plus whatever the diamonds are worth, maybe another 50,000, conservatively, would give you and your daughter a fresh start somewhere far from here. No one would ever have to know about the rest of it. And the evidence? Eleanor's documentation? Burn it. Forget you ever found it. Live your life. Priya paused. That's the safe choice. Carmen looked at her daughter, at the picture book in her small hands, at the exhaustion and hunger that still lingered in her young face despite the miraculous discovery. She thought about Eleanor Ashford, who had spent 40 years documenting crimes she knew she might never expose, who had hidden this cash with the hope that someday, somehow, justice might find a way. What's the other choice? Carmen asked. Priya's eyes lit with something between admiration and fear. The other choice is war. Carmen chose war. The first step was verification. Priya called in favours from former colleagues at larger firms, consulted with forensic accountants, reached out to historians who specialised in the civil rights era. Every piece of Eleanor's documentation was authenticated. The photographs were genuine. The recordings, transferred from deteriorating cassette tapes, were clear enough for voice analysis. The financial documents matched patterns of fraud that investigators had suspected for decades, but never been able to prove. While the verification proceeded, Carmen used a small portion of the cash to secure a modest apartment. Nothing fancy, just a warm, safe place with running water and a door that locked. She enrolled Lucia in a proper school, bought groceries that didn't come from food banks, replaced the child's worn shoes with ones that fit. These small acts of normality felt like miracles after months of survival mode. And Carmen wept the first night she put her daughter to bed in an actual bed, in an actual room, in an actual home. But the peace was an illusion, and Carmen knew it. The Pembertons learned of her existence 3 weeks into the new year. She never discovered how. Perhaps a leak from one of the experts Priya had consulted. Perhaps surveillance they had maintained on the salvage yard. Perhaps simple bad luck. What mattered was that one cold January morning, a black Mercedes appeared in the parking lot of the apartment complex, and a man in an expensive suit knocked on Carmen's door. Ms. Delgado. He didn't phrase it as a question. My name is Richard Crane. I represent the Pemberton family. They would like to speak with you regarding certain property that may have come into your possession. Carmen kept the chain on the door, her heart pounding. I don't know what you're talking about. Crane smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. I think you do. An old school bus, a lockbox, documents that belong to the family. The Pembertons are reasonable people, Miss Delgado. They have no wish to involve the authorities. They simply want their property returned. In exchange, they're prepared to offer you a significant sum. Shall we say $50,000? Enough to start fresh somewhere pleasant. Everyone walks away happy. And if I say no? The smile remained, but the eyes went cold. Then things become complicated. You're a single mother, Miss Delgado, living just above the poverty line, working jobs that don't require background checks or references. If someone were to inform Child Protective Services that your daughter had been living in a vehicle, sleeping in temperatures that constituted child endangerment, he shrugged elegantly. I'm sure you understand. Carmen understood perfectly. She understood that this man, this messenger, this servant of wealth and power, was threatening to take her daughter away. She understood that the Pembertons, having built their empire on the exploitation of the vulnerable, saw her as just another problem to be solved through intimidation and money. She understood with a fury that burned white-hot in her chest that these were the people Eleanor Ashford had spent 40 years fighting against. Get away from my door, Carmen said, her voice steady despite her fear, and tell your employers that they will hear from my lawyer. The threats escalated after that. Carmen's car, a used Honda she had purchased with the cash, was vandalized in the apartment parking lot. Her mailbox was stuffed with photographs of Lucia at school, at the playground, walking to the bus stop, each one a silent message. We are watching. We can reach her whenever we want. Anonymous complaints appeared at Lucia's school, alleging neglect, alleging instability, alleging concerns that required investigation. A social worker visited, kind but thorough, asking questions that Carmen answered with desperate honesty, while Lucia sat in her clean room, surrounded by toys and books, clearly loved, clearly cared for, clearly not the victim of neglect the anonymous complaints suggested. "Someone is targeting you," the social worker said quietly, as she prepared to leave. "I can see that. This house is fine. Your daughter is healthy and happy. But whoever is making these complaints isn't going to stop." "I know," Carmen said. "I'm dealing with it." Priya worked around the clock, building a case that grew more damaging with each passing day. She found 3 of the other workers Eleanor had documented, elderly women now, who were willing to testify about the wages stolen from them decades ago. She located Sarah's son, James, now a 62-year-old retired postal worker in Birmingham, who had spent his entire life wondering about his origins. She connected with journalists at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who had been trying to investigate the Pembertons for years without sufficient evidence. And she made contact with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, whose agents looked at Eleanor's documentation like wolves who had finally scented prey. The Pembertons responded with increasing desperation. Carmen received a letter offering $200,000 for the documents, 4 times the original offer. When she didn't respond, the offer doubled. When she still didn't respond, Richard Crane appeared at Priya's office with a check for $1 million and a non-disclosure agreement. "This is more money than your client will ever see in her lifetime," Crane said, his polished facade beginning to crack. "She's a hotel maid living in Section 8 housing. The Pembertons are offering her generational wealth. All she has to do is sign and walk away." "My client isn't interested in walking away," Priya replied. "My client is interested in justice." "Justice?" Crane laughed, but there was fear beneath it now. "Your client found money that was stolen from the Pembertons 40 years ago. If she wants to talk about justice, perhaps we should discuss the criminal charges she faces for receiving stolen property." "Go ahead," Priya smiled. "File the charges. Explain in open court where that money came from. Explain why it was hidden in a lockbox under the floor of a dead woman's school bus. Explain why none of it appears on any tax return or financial statement. Explain the diamonds that the family never declared to the IRS. I'm sure the federal investigators would be very interested in that testimony." Crane left without another word. That night, Carmen's apartment building received a bomb threat. Everyone was evacuated into the January cold, while police swept the premises. They found nothing, but Carmen understood the message. Next time might be different. She held Lucia close in the parking lot, wrapped in blankets that neighbours had brought out, and she whispered into her daughter's hair, "I will not let them win. I will not let them break us. We have come too far." The confrontation was set for February 14th, a date Priya had chosen deliberately. Valentine's Day, a day when the courts were closed and the Pembertons could not file emergency motions to stop what was coming. Carmen would meet with Harrison Pemberton himself at the family's Atlanta estate, and she would give them one final chance to do the right thing before she brought their world crashing down. The Pemberton estate sprawled across 40 acres of prime Buckhead real estate, protected by iron, with gates and security cameras and 100 years of accumulated wealth. Carmen arrived alone. Lucia was safe with Priya's mother, surrounded by security that Priya had hired from her own savings. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her grandmother's gold cross around her neck, the only piece of jewellery she hadn't sold during the desperate months before the bus. A servant escorted her through rooms filled with paintings and antiques, past displays of porcelain and silver, up a sweeping staircase to a study that overlooked manicured gardens. Every surface spoke of old money, of generational privilege, of a world so far removed from cold nights in a school bus that Carmen felt she had stepped into another dimension entirely. Harrison Pemberton waited behind a mahogany desk that had cost more than Carmen had ever earned in a year. He was 63 years old, silver-haired and patrician, with the handsome, weathered face of a man who had never known a moment of true hardship. Beside him stood Richard Crane and a woman Carmen recognized from photographs, Victoria Pemberton, Harrison's wife, her expression arranged into polite disdain. "Ms. Delgado," Harrison's voice was smooth, cultured, the voice of a man accustomed to deference. "Please sit. Can we offer you coffee? Tea?" "No," Carmen remained standing. I'm not here for hospitality. I'm here to give you a chance to make this right before I destroy everything you've built. Victoria let out a small, contemptuous laugh. Destroy everything we've built? My dear, do you have any idea who you're speaking to? The Pembertons have shaped this state for 4 generations. We've endured scandals and recessions and wars, and you think some cleaning woman with a box of old papers is going to bring us down? I think your family has been stealing from working people for 70 years, Carmen said, her voice steady. I think your father-in-law raped a teenage maid and paid $10,000 to make the resulting child disappear. I think you've defrauded the IRS of tens of millions in unreported assets. I think your charitable foundations are money laundering operations, and your political donations are bribes disguised as civic engagement. And I think Eleanor Ashford documented all of it before she died. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria's face had gone pale. Harrison's hands, resting on the desk, had begun to tremble. Only Richard Crane maintained his composure, but his eyes had gone flat and dangerous. Whatever documents you think you have, Harrison began. I don't think I have them, Carmen interrupted. I know I have them. I have 40 years of evidence that your father spent his life accumulating other people's labour and calling it his own success. I have recordings, I have photographs, I have financial documents your accountants would very much prefer stayed hidden. And in exactly 48 hours, unless you agree to my terms, every major news outlet in the state will have copies of everything. Your terms, Harrison's voice had lost its smoothness. You come into my home, threaten my family, and you think you have the right to make demands? Your family threatened to take my daughter away from me. Carmen stepped closer to the desk, and something in her posture made all 3 of them lean back. Your family photographed her walking to school? Your family called in false reports to Child Protective Services? Your family tried to destroy us because we had the audacity to survive the poverty your family helped create. So, yes, I think I have the right to make demands. She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder, laying it on the desk. These are my terms. First, full restitution to every worker your family defrauded. My lawyer has identified 43 surviving workers or their estates. The total, with interest, comes to $12 million. Second, a public acknowledgement of the crimes committed by Cornelius Pemberton III, including the assault on Sarah Williams and the existence of his son, James Williams, who deserves to know where he came from. Third, the immediate resignation of Harrison Pemberton from all public positions and the withdrawal of his gubernatorial candidacy. Fourth, a $2 million donation to establish a fund supporting the children of domestic workers. You're insane, Victoria spat. We'll never agree to this. We'll fight you in every court. Let her finish, Harrison said quietly. His face had aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. Fifth, Carmen continued, the Pemberton family will make no attempt to retaliate against me, my daughter, my lawyer, or anyone else involved in this matter. Any hint of harassment, any accident, any suspicious occurrence affecting anyone I care about, and the evidence goes public immediately, with explicit instructions about who to blame. And if we agree to all this? Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. Then the criminal evidence goes to my lawyer's safe, where it stays unless you violate these terms. The IRS investigation will proceed based on what investigators have already gathered. I can't stop that, but the most damaging material, the recordings, the photographs, the evidence of assault, that stays private, as long as you hold up your end. This is extortion, Richard Crane said flatly. No, Carmen turned to face him. Extortion is threatening to take a child away from her mother because she found evidence of your crimes. Extortion is vandalizing a car and photographing a 7-year-old and calling in bomb threats. What I'm offering is a choice. You can pay the people you stole from and acknowledge the harm you've caused, or you can watch everything your family built turn to ash. That's not extortion. That's consequences. Victoria was crying now, silent tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. Harrison sat slumped in his chair, staring at nothing. Only Richard Crane seemed to retain any fight, but even he must have seen the mathematics. The evidence was too solid, the crimes too numerous, the exposure too complete. We need time to discuss this, Harrison said finally. You have until tomorrow at noon. Carmen picked up her bag. After that, the deadline becomes 48 hours, and every hour you delay, someone new receives a copy of Eleanor's files. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the New York Times, the FBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Your choice. She turned and walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back one final time. I want you to understand something. I'm not doing this for money. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this because 40 years ago, a woman named Eleanor Ashford decided that the truth mattered, that justice mattered, that people like you shouldn't be allowed to get away with crushing people like me forever. She couldn't expose you while she was alive. She was too afraid, too powerless, too alone. But she left everything she gathered to whoever found it, hoping someone would have the courage to finish what she started. That person is me, and I will not fail her. She left the study, walked down the sweeping staircase, past the displays of stolen wealth, and emerged into the February afternoon. The sun was setting over the manicured gardens, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Carmen Delgado, former hotel maid, former homeless mother, current owner of a $300 school bus that had contained $2 million in secrets, walked to her car with her head held high. The call came at 11:15 the next morning. They agreed to everything. 6 months later, Carmen stood in a courtyard in Birmingham, Alabama, watching a man she had never met embrace a truth he had waited 62 years to learn. James Williams had his father's eyes, Cornelius Pemberton's eyes, and his mother's strength, the strength of a woman who had survived being violated and silenced and separated from her child, who had built a life anyway, who had died never knowing if her son was happy or safe or loved. She never stopped looking for you, Carmen said softly, handing him the photograph Eleanor had preserved, Sarah holding infant James in front of the Pemberton mansion, proof that he had existed, that he had mattered, that he had been wanted. Eleanor wrote that your mother called every year on your birthday, pretending to be someone else, just to hear them say you were alive. James held the photograph with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. I always knew there was something, he whispered, something missing, something I couldn't name. And now you know, Carmen touched his arm. Now everyone knows. The Pemberton settlement had been front-page news for weeks. $12 million distributed to 43 families whose labor had been stolen, some receiving checks that changed their lives forever, others receiving payments that went to children and grandchildren of workers who had died still waiting for justice. The $2 million fund for children of domestic workers had already granted its first scholarships, and James Williams, acknowledged at last as the biological son of Cornelius Pemberton III, had received a settlement of his own, money that could never compensate for a lifetime of questions, but that at least represented an admission of wrong. Harrison Pemberton had withdrawn from the gubernatorial race, citing health reasons. The IRS investigation was ongoing, grinding through decades of financial manipulation. Victoria Pemberton had filed for divorce and retreated to a house in the Bahamas, far from the reporters and the shame and the collapse of everything she had believed about her husband's family. The truth, once released, had proven more devastating than any of them had anticipated. Carmen used her share of the settlement, the $200,000 Eleanor had hidden plus a negotiated additional sum for her role in exposing the fraud, to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood in Marietta, not far from where her journey had begun. It was nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom cottage with a yard and a porch and a kitchen where she could cook real meals for her daughter. But it was hers, paid for in cash, secured by truth, built on the foundation of a courage she hadn't known she possessed. The school bus sat in the backyard, still rusted, still ugly, still miraculous. Carmen couldn't bring herself to sell it. She had cleaned it out, fixed the heater, replaced the broken windows, and sometimes, on warm evenings, she and Lucia would sit inside on the old vinyl bench seats and eat ice cream and look at the stars through the skylights Carmen had installed. "Mama?" Lucia asked one evening, as they watched the summer constellations wheel overhead. "Why do you keep the bus? It's so ugly." Carmen smiled, pulling her daughter close. "Because this bus saved us, Mija. When we had nothing, when everyone laughed at us, when the whole world seemed determined to break us down, this bus kept us moving. It kept us together. It held a secret that changed everything. She paused, running her hand over the worn vinyl. And because I never want to forget where we came from, I never want to forget how hard we fought, how much we survived, how close we came to losing everything. This bus reminds me that the ugly things, the broken things, the things nobody else wants, sometimes those are the things that save you. Like what you said the first day, Lucia remembered, when the people were laughing. Exactly like that. Carmen kissed her daughter's forehead. I made you a promise that day. I promised this bus would take us somewhere better. And it did. It took us here. Priya Sharma had become more than a lawyer. She had become a friend, a sister in arms, a partner in the ongoing fight for workers' rights that Eleanor Ashford's evidence had ignited. Together, they had founded a non-profit legal clinic specializing in wage theft and labor exploitation, providing free representation to domestic workers and day laborers who faced the same systemic robbery the Pembertons had perfected. The clinic had already recovered over $3 million in stolen wages in its first year of operation, and requests for help arrived daily from across the southeast. Carmen had discovered something unexpected in the work, a purpose that extended beyond survival, beyond revenge, beyond even justice for Eleanor and Sarah and all the workers whose labour had built the Pemberton fortune. She had discovered that her own story mattered, that her own voice carried weight, that a woman who had once been homeless and afraid and dismissed could stand before rooms full of people and speak truths that shook the foundations of power. She spoke at churches and community centres and labour union meetings. She testified before the state legislature about the epidemic of wage theft. She appeared on podcasts and news programmes, telling the story of the bus, the lockbox, the 40 years of hidden evidence, and always, always the lesson that Eleanor Ashford had spent her life embodying, that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will find a way to emerge. On the first anniversary of finding the lockbox, Carmen drove the school bus, still ugly, still loud, still beautiful, to the cemetery where Eleanor Ashford was buried. It was a small grave in a neglected corner of an old churchyard, marked only by a simple headstone that read, Eleanor Ashford, 1933-2016, she served. Carmen knelt beside the grave and placed a bouquet of wildflowers against the stone. I don't know if you can hear me, she said softly. I don't know if you ever imagined that someone like me would find what you left behind. But I wanted you to know. It mattered. All those years you spent collecting evidence, protecting documents, hiding the truth until someone could use it. It mattered. You couldn't fight them while you were alive, but you made sure they couldn't escape forever. You gave me the weapon I needed to win a war you started 40 years ago. She paused, watching the wind move through the grass, stirring the leaves of the old oak that shaded Eleanor's grave. I'm raising my daughter to be brave, Carmen continued. I'm raising her to understand that sometimes the ugly things, the broken things, the things nobody else wants, sometimes those are the things that save you. I'm raising her to know that the truth is always worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible, even when the powerful seem invincible, even when everyone around you laughs and says you can't win. She stood, brushing grass from her knees, and looked back at the school bus parked at the cemetery entrance, her rusted chariot, her $300 salvation, her connection to a woman she had never met but would honour forever. Thank you, Eleanor, Carmen whispered, for believing that someday someone would find you, for trusting that the truth would survive. The drive home was quiet, the summer evening soft and golden, the bus rumbling along country roads that wound through hills and farms and small towns where people were just sitting down to dinner. Carmen thought about all the miles this bus had travelled, from school routes to salvage yards, to highway shoulders, to parking lots, where a mother and daughter had huddled against the cold. She thought about all the secrets it had carried, all the years it had waited, all the hope it had preserved in a metal box beneath the driver's seat. When she pulled into her driveway, Lucia was waiting on the porch with Priya, the two of them laughing about something, their faces lit by the glow of evening sun. Carmen sat for a moment in the driver's seat, looking at her daughter, her friend, her home, the life she had built from nothing, the family she had forged from fragments, the future she had carved from impossibility, and she remembered what her grandmother used to say, that God writes straight with crooked lines, that every ending contains a beginning, that the darkest nights produce the brightest stars. Carmen had been laughed at for buying a rusted school bus for $300. She had been mocked and scorned and dismissed. She had been a punchline, a spectacle, a symbol of everything that respectable people pitied and feared becoming. But she had never stopped moving. She had never stopped believing. She had never stopped being the mother her daughter needed, the warrior Eleanor's truth demanded, the woman her grandmother had raised her to be. And in the end, the people who laughed were the ones left with nothing. Nothing but the ashes of empires built on stolen labour and buried secrets, watching from the ruins as a single mother in a rusted school bus drove into a future they never saw coming. Because that is what mothers do. They survive, they endure, they transform $300 and desperate faith into legacies that outlast the monuments of the powerful. They take the ugly things, the broken things, the things nobody else wants, and they make them into miracles every single time.